Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I know everybody's trying to pivot between sessions. But I am Alison Justice, and I'm going to talk about drying and curing, aka post-harvest. So just to give you a little bit of my background where you can kind of understand where my thought process come from and why I do what I do is, so I come from a farming family, third generation. Today on the land that my grandparents grew, we grow hemp, so a type of cannabis. But I got my start at Clemson University as far as on the academic side and got a PhD in plant science. Loved it, but it was in ornamentals. But it's been kind of beautiful how being in ornamentals has transitioned so well for me over into cannabis and specifically post-harvest. My specific grad work was with mycorrhizae and nutrient uptake, auxin, et cetera, but paying for my grad school, I had to do work for Dr. Faust, and he did a lot of work with shipping of unrooted cuttings. So this is a kind of a live plant that you're putting in a package and sending in the mail, and cut flowers. And so plants that are affected by the condition you're putting them in. And a plant's a plant, and so it's all very similar, but again, not necessarily the same as cannabis, but a lot of things you can draw from. So I skipped a little bit. So I got my start in cannabis about 2016, moved out to San Diego, worked for a cannabis company that grew indoor, outdoor, greenhouse. Actually, greenhouse was the biggest portion. And, again, being in 2016, a woman put into, a man's world, which is all agriculture, it's fine. Something I've grew up with, but telling growers who have been doing this for a long time, not telling, but working with them and trying to understand some of their methods and reasoning behind certain methods. And the first project I did was lighting and working with fluence and pip and just kind of trying to understand, this was right at the first of LEDs and, can you even flower under an LED? You can. And, with LEDs, higher light, higher yield. Obviously, there's a cutoff point there, but, science comes in for the win. And so that's kind of what I've based my career around is, coming from not a rich farming family, understanding where you got to save those pennies, being trained in grad school and understanding the science and marrying those two. And, having money, having science create profits. So I moved back to South Carolina about 3.5 years in San Diego, and my mom got one of the first licenses there. So she started growing, I bounced back and forth, eventually moved back home and started the hemp mine. And so the hemp mine is one of the driving forces that supports my passion. Being that I breed, we breed type 2 and 3. We sell consumer goods, et cetera, all around the Southeast. But my heart is within research. And so I developed the Cannabis Research Coalition, which is a union. I borrowed the idea from the Floriculture Research Alliance. So it's where stakeholders in the industry, growers, big, large, vendors, anybody who cares and has reason to support this industry moving forward, they pull their money and help support research, which is supporting grad students. It's supporting research that we do in-house, specifically at the hemp mine, and turns out science that's immediately applicable. Science is good for the reason of science, but when it comes to a farmer and what really matters to them, it's money. It's money and being able to support that business. And so, the science we bring is immediately applicable. So whether it's, helping figure out, like Mike sitting right here, he's one of the CRC members. grad students that's put out a lot of our work. You know, him going through and looking at, all right, well, 12-12 is not the end-all be-all, especially if you're growing outside. You know, it's never just 12-12 when you want it to be. You've got to understand how to work your different varieties and optimize them. You know, is it just 2 hours more light and you get more yield? Sometimes. And so that's the type of work we like to do to support our members in the group. This is one of my favorite quotes because it's true and eloquently put. You know, we're at an unprecedented time in history of plant science where there's a plant that's so valuable that research is wide open. And that's really what got me into cannabis is just, of course, I appreciate the plant, but and its effects. But you know, if I wanted to go and study apples or poinsettias, there's a bajillion research papers out there. But if I want to study cannabis, you know, I think Nurit here from Israel, she got started before all of us. And, you know, her first studies were ultimately very elementary, not because she's an elementary scientist, but just because it's so new that we have to lay down that foundation to then build off and get to the point we are with other crops. So I got off his quote, but it's a beautiful quote if you read the rest. So here are some of our members. You know, like I said, it's small, you know, 500 square feet hemp growers all the way to very large growers, vendors, big and small. And it's just a really nice union of people who care about science and care about digging deeper and understanding what's going on. The other thing that we do is a lot of third-party testing. So if you have, just for example's sake, you have a piece of equipment that sterilizes products in the drying room. Well, let's say ozone, for example. Sure, ozone in research, you could find that it's a sterilizing agent. All right, but where is your data coming from? Was it from, you know, your own internal team? Do you need third-party validation to where you have more than just your own data to show that your product's working? Or taking a variety and, you know, doing like we do in ornamentals, where if I'm growing Prestige Red, poinsettia, it comes with a technical guide where you know how to grow it. You know how much nitrogen put on. You know if you flip it at this day, it's going to take 7 weeks to grow, whatever it may be. You know, it's all there for you, and you tweak it to your growing environment. Whereas now, a breeder, and you know, I'm sure it's not every, I'm sure there's some out there that might do it differently, but right now, usually it's you get a seed, you get a clone, and it's good luck. You know, and you spend your commercial dollars tweaking it for 5 years to get it optimized, and then it's time to retire that variety. So, you know, we'll take that and we'll optimize it and give you that technical guide and get you going where it's not wasted growth space. Okay, so today, post-harvest production. I just want to clarify, there's lots of ways to do post-harvest, right? It's all about, you know, are you doing it for extraction? Are you going to freeze it and blast it? Lots of ways. But today's talk is really going to be based off of smokable flower and how that portion should come together and things to think about in your own grow. Okay, so basically my abstract says this. You know, how do you properly build out your curing space? What are the set points you want? You know, how is it continually improved, et cetera, et cetera. This is all extremely generic. And I'm going to answer this slide in a sentence. 60-60. If you want the generic guidelines, 60-60, right? But you're going to be just like everybody else, and you're going to ride that train until we find out the next step. But how are we going to find out the next step of how we're optimizing this plant, how we're optimizing this process? It's not just sitting on one metric that has been done for many, many years, which works good. There's some fantastic weed out there that's grown with just simply these metrics. But I think we can push it forward further. And so how are we really going to answer these questions? How are we really going to master post-harvest? Well, that's by understanding the plant physiology that's happening in post-harvest. So I put the picture of photosynthesis up because it's just an example. You know, you might think, I've got my setup, got my 60/60 and works fine. I'm working with it. It's great. But, you know, if you think back again to the LED HPS battle days, and not saying that HPS is bad, you know, it's got its place for certain situations. But if we didn't study the LEDs, a new technology period of LEDs, understanding that we can flower with it, understanding how we have to change and tweak those other methods, you know, maybe your humidity's really high now since you're using LEDs. You can't just throw it away and say, well, it didn't work. You have to tweak your growing conditions to be able to take use of this technology and this new optimization for pushing science forward, which ultimately, more light, more yield, more money. And so that's where we're getting with post-harvest. You know, it's one of those things that has been looked at the least so far, you know, more than cultivation, and there's even less to compare it to as far as other crops. So, you know, I feel even myself, I've been dragging my feet since 2006, wanting to dig so deep into this, but things take time, especially when you're not in academia. You know, we're supporting this research as much as we can. So we got to learn, first off, what's this plant? What is it made of? You know, we have to understand the basics. So trichomes, you know, that's where the good stuff is. The cannabinoids, the terpenes, flavonoids, these other pieces that you might have not even heard of, but are extremely important with other crops. You know, this is, the trichome head is where those are made. So being tender, for lack of a better word, being tender with those cells is important. So that'll make a little more sense in a minute. But when we're growing flower to sell a smokable flower, it's not just trichomes, right? You've got the other pieces of the plant. It's not a leaf, but there's still many cell walls. You know, there's elemental nutrients. There's a lot in there. And so how do we manipulate not just what we need to for those trichomes, but what do we need to manipulate in that plant material as well? All right, so this is a graph that I have held dear for many years, but if you're talking food science, this is elementary for a food scientist, right? It's all about water. It's all about water. It's all about water because of microbial growth. I like to say that it's a zombie state, right? This plant is not dead, but it's not necessarily living in the fact of having roots. It's somewhere in between. And so understanding it and comparing it to other crops can be tough because it's not a cut flower like a rose. You know, a cut flower is you're just wanting to preserve it as long as possible to have those petals to stay put and be pretty. This isn't unrooted cuttings that are meant to be stuck again because you're not wanting to preserve it to keep living. You know, the best comparison, which it's not 100%, is tobacco. It is a leaf, but it has trichomes, and there is an active that you're wanting to pull from that plant, nicotine, and there is aromatic compounds that you're wanting to preserve in a way. So again, not a perfect fit, not a perfect model for what we're wanting to do and look at, but you know, we got to start somewhere. So this is something I threw together, you know, back in 2017 to start to try to wrap my head around, you know, what are these stop and start points? You know, I at least need to know what's the water activity that is not going to allow for botrytis growth or whatever microbe you might have. Again, it's all about water and removing that water. But it's not perfect. It's not just get to this certain point and it's done and they're all dead and, you're good to go, right? It's a process. And depending on how big the bud is and how its crevices are and what your environmentals are in the room, it's all pretty complicated. But we've got our starting point and we've got our stopping point, which is 0.6. But let me get to water activity in general. So if you don't know what water activity is, it's the amount of available water that microorganisms can grow on. And so this is the standard for food science, because if you're drying raisins or beef jerky, the point is to remove all of that water that's up for grabs for those microbes. And so it's from a range from 1, which is a fresh plant, to 0, which is bone dry, and a sliding scale. You don't want to be at 0, because then you would have bud that just crumbles in your hand. You can't be too wet because you have microbes. Usually the people want it at about 0.6, but there's all that time between where we're playing a game. All right, so I've graduated to this slide. It's a little more clear for my eyes, but it's got the same concept. And so we talked about water. Getting water out stops microbial growth, but keep in mind it doesn't kill the microbes that are there. So even if it dried down to 0.2, resting spores can go through all sorts of heat and really rough treatment, and it's still there. So if you re-wet it, it still would grow. But this is going to stop it from continuing to grow. Again, you've got 1 to 0. Well, as you move down that scale of water content, but water content that's available, and we'll get into why I'm kind of emphasizing some of those words, things slow down. So think about it this way. If you are lacking water, if you don't drink water for a few days, your organs are going to begin to shut down and you're going to die eventually. And there's no difference in plants. And so if it's turgid, if it's a living plant, these microbes could grow as you start losing water. Enzymatic things are happening. Things are happening in this zombie plant. And then eventually it stops. So again, it's this portion of zombie that we've got to understand. All right, well, in basic, how does water escape the plant? It's cut-ins, because we cut these plants, stomata, ruptured cells, and hathoids. And you probably know what these are, maybe not this word, but it'll make sense in a minute. All right, so how does water move through plants? Again, it's this delicate dance of what's the pressure and available water in the soil, and how does that go through these, we want to think of them as straws, but they're not necessarily straws, meaning xylem. So xylem is the structures that water move from the roots up and out the stomata. Opening those stomata, water coming up, is how water goes out, so transpiration, just like we sweat, for lack of better comparison. But it's a costly process. It's energy spent. CO2 in, water out, O2 out. All of that is very controllable by us based on the environment it's put in. And so that's with roots or without. That's why having your set points in your rooms are so important. But it's a very much different process when this plant does not have roots. So we've all not watered plants on accident, and we have wilty plants. Well, that's because the plants are losing water. They can't take it from the soil, and so usually the leaves are the first to go, keeps losing water, and what's happening is that the cells themselves, the plasma membrane within the cell, instead of being turgid and holding the plant turgid and erect, when you lose water, it shrinks. And so then those walls begin to shrink, and then the plant wilts. So that's important to keep in mind as we're going through, because it's all about the transfer of water. All right, so that's transpiration. That's how it loses water when it has roots. But we're cutting this plant. So imagine that's a plug. When it's studied pretty deeply in cut flowers. When the plant's cut, those cells at the stem, they are filled with air. And so it basically makes a plug. And so now, if we're thinking post-harvest, we have a plant that's plugged on one end. We have stomata that's most likely trying to close, depending on, there's hormones that can manipulate the stomates. There's, if you put it in the dark, they're going to close. So there's all sorts of interacting pieces that are allowing or not allowing this to lose water. And so here's just a picture of the stomate. If you've never seen it, very inexpensive microscope or hand lens will allow you to see the stomates in your plant. It's pretty neat to see it. Pretty neat to have a cutting wilt and look at the stomates, because they change and you can see that change. Okay, so this is a better representation for cut-ins, right? So you cut it, there forms an embolism in that xylem, and the flow, that transfer of one end to the other ceases. So what's happening when we're drying? So this is the hathoid, hydathoid. It's a hard word, but that's where guttation comes from. So if you have ever, maybe in the morning, you get up and some of your porch plants have these little droplets on it, or maybe your HVAC messes up and it's really humid in your grow room. Well, what's happening is that the pressure from the air is not allowing the water to escape. It's kind of keeping it put. The roots are saturated, and so the water wants to come out, but the climate above is not allowing it. So it just bubbles up there, right where it's escaping. And so you can see on the real picture where those bubbles are, and that's where that water is escaping. So again, plasmosis being so important, just the transfer of water, the movement of water being so important for drying and curing. So, looking through all the papers, thinking about an apple. And I like to have these examples because it helps me wrap my head around potentially what's happening with cannabis. So think about an apple. You've got it sitting on your counter, and every day it's getting older. It's just room temperature, and then it's starting to get mushy. And so that in itself is a factor of losing the water. The sugars are beginning to break down, and eventually you're going to get browning. And so one kind of really interesting piece to think about is the cells and how much pressure they have. So a little bitty cell, it has as much pressure in it as a tire. And so if you think about how much just minute amounts of water leaving those cells or entering those cells is changing that pressure, that's a lot of pressure. In apples and tobacco, the plant's rapidly losing that pressure, destroying those plasma membranes and just the cell wall and everything, just from, going from something that's as tight as a tire to nothing. That's a huge change. That's stopping things, that's killing cells, and that's causing browning. And so, we're not just talking about water in a straw that you can just release and it's free. This water's bound. It has this purpose. If we're starting on the right, here we're looking at water activity and moisture content, and it's not a straight line. And it's not a straight line of wet and dry, because the water is bound. And so again, starting on the right, we have unbound water. And so, if you're at 1 a 1 water activity going down to 6, that's your free water. That's the water that's easy to leave. You know, if you think about in your dry room, that first day, you're losing a lot. Your dehu's running all the time because that water is easily leaving. And then we get to about 0.6. It's a lot more bound. You know, it's in cells. It's held up by this capillary condensation, and it's harder to evaporate. We're never really put down to 0.2 in cannabis because that's super dry, but this is the extremely bound water, water that wouldn't freeze if you tried to, because it's so incorporated into, you know, the other whatever it may be that it's part of. Okay, so I'm going to jump into tobacco pretty deeply. I am ashamed I didn't put the reference on this, but I'm happy to give it to anybody who wants it. The next few slides are in regards to this paper, who put this picture up. In tobacco, there's air-cured, sun-cured, and flue-cured. And this is all about the curing process. And in tobacco, they call curing, it's the drying portion and resting portion, if you will. It's all called curing. So if I say curing, that's what I mean. It's drying and curing. But the point with tobacco is, first off, for the first 2 days to have it very high humidity, 75%, if not more, and really high temperatures, way higher temperatures than we would use in cannabis. The aromas are not quite as intense as what we have in cannabis, so I feel they can be a little harsher with it. And if you think back to the beginning of tobacco, everybody was using drying barns. So for tobacco, this is pretty scientific, with years of backup of practice and data. But air-cured and sun-cured, they look the brownest in this picture, right? It's because they are. That's because within these two processes, the water, whether it's out in the sun or in a barn, the water is up and down, right? So it's releasing and it's absorbing, depending many times on what's happening outside. You know, is it raining? You know, I know when I grow hemp for isolate extraction, I don't care what happens because I know the cannabinoids are going to be, you know, they're going to be solid. I'm not losing my cannabinoids, and I don't care about the terpenes. So yeah, dry it as fast as possible, and if it takes 4 weeks because it's raining the whole time, you know, it doesn't really matter. But if we're talking high quality cannabis that we're wanting to smoke and be safe, you know, it's not necessarily the process you want to go through. But what I want to show very clearly is the differences. The flue cure, which is heat applied, and again, it's much higher temperatures than we would use in cannabis, but the color difference. And so flue cured is, again, really high humidity for the first 2 days, and then it's dropped down and dried. Well, you can see it's not as brown. And I think we're going to find that cycling, you know, even if you have your set points at 60-60, how good is your HVAC system? Is it actually turning on at 65, and then you battle your dehu? And so even at the best, most expensive setup, you know, with traditional drying, you've got these crazy swings. And if you're a grower that, you know, maybe you have a pretty rough setup, which we all do, you know, when you're starting or whatnot, it's expensive equipment. The more swings you have, the more browning you see. In tobacco, it's very well known that if you're drying too fast, if you're pulling water out of those cells too fast, you're damaging everything within that cell, and the browning happens. So in this example, they were using freeze-dried as the control. And so freeze-drying, it completely stops all processes. So it's nice and green because there's no chlorophyll degradation. And nothing that we'll talk about here in a moment that's happened with these other types of curing happens with freeze-dried. So is anybody freeze-drying their flower? No? Well, I've heard of a lot of people doing it, and I've seen it, and it's nice and pretty. I mean, it's nice and green, very green. It stays nice and green. But it would be really interesting to see a panel have a smoke test and see if it is, in fact, harsher or not. Okay, so this is just a quick example, of looking at those first 48 hours with drying tobacco and seeing, they're wanting these processes to be sped up by the temperature, by the humidity, and they want that to happen in the first 48 hours. Then they call that next section the fixation. So they want to keep it nice and yellow, but now it's time to dry it. So this is something Mike and Dr. Faust threw together, I think sometime last year. And so it's looking at days in drying versus moisture content. And so this is at different temperatures, different relative humidities, and what that would equate to as far as VPD goes. And so, you've got days 1 through 6, you've got a very fast dry, and the buds are going to be uneven as far as moisture goes. You've got a bud, the quickest way out, the least resistance, is those cells on the outside. It loses moisture. All right, so you pull it down in 6 days, you put it in a bucket to cure. Well, all that water from the middle of the bud's coming out and rehydrating the outside of the bud, and it's eventually all gonna homogenize as far as moisture content goes. But is that causing more browning than we realize? On the reverse side, if you're letting it go really long, very high potential for microbial growth. So there's a sweet spot. I think this is still something very much to be worked on. But I hope this kind of helps you wrap your head around where are we getting these numbers from. And, if you're looking at, at least what Clemson believes is a nice sweet spot, it is within that 60-60 range. So, good job, legacy growers. Okay, so mold's gone. We understand what VPD is putting us at as far as water activity goes. So let's look at these enzymatic activities that are happening. And so where I put the little sun, that represents what I'm considering the critical point of where these processes are happening. 0.6 is really where the consumer wants it. And so we're dry enough to where microbial stop, but we're still in this sweet, like your zombie's kind of still alive zone. All right, so we're gonna look at this again. Up in the right, we're gonna compare moisture content and water activity. All right, so if we are looking at what I started in the slide before as being 0.65, if we're looking at that and wanting to be able to compare it to this graph, we've got to figure out what that moisture content would be. So somewhere around 0.5 would be 18%. And so we gather that from that graph on the top right, and let's apply it to the drying rate graph. It's kind of hard to see, but you can't really see it. But there is an orange square around the portion that is above 0.65. And so in my mind, this is that sweet spot where if we are determining some of the processes that are in tobacco happening in cannabis, this is where it would be happening. All right, so now we're past microbes. What's happening inside? So carbon metabolites. This is the energy of the plant. This is the primary metabolite, with terpenes and cannabinoids all being secondary. This is an important piece of the plant. We've got our structural carbohydrate types, cellulose, hemulose. We've got our non-structural types. So this is the starches and the sugars. These are the types that we can manipulate and change if we want to. All right, so tobacco. Why is sugar so important in tobacco? Why is specifically starch to sugar conversion so important? Well, here's an example. Really just looking at these first two columns, if you're looking at the freeze-dried plant, almost considering it stopped in time, so this is what's in a fresh leaf, really high starch content. But regardless of the tobacco type curing method, it drops drastically. And then vice versa, the sugars increase drastically. Again, no matter the specific process that they do within. So we have that. And so why do we care about this at all? Well, years and years of data, we love smoking sugar. Why does everybody walk around with the big vapes, the clouds? It's because those are full of sugar and they taste delicious. They just do. Still today, tobacco is infused with sugar. In the US, there's still cigarettes that are infused with sugar because they smoke better. So it makes quite good sense that part of what we're doing in drying and curing in that 60-60, potentially within those first few days of drying, is starch to sugar conversion. All right, plastid pigments. It's not just starch to conversion. If you also think about wine and how complicated that is, just from one grape, if it's in a different region or if it's in a different type of oak barrel, all these flavors and aroma are changing and becoming complex, and none of that's completely understood. There's some magic in it, I suppose. And I'm sure it's the same with cannabis, and I think we'll probably spend many, many years working out all these details. But when I say plastid pigments, I mean, the chlorophyll, the carotenoids. All of these are precursors for aroma. And so, with tobacco and research, the degradation of these can be a negative effect because it affects aroma. Polyphenols, so again, talking about wines, you got your tannins, your flavonoids, all these complex aroma pieces that are developing depending on what you do with it in post-harvest. Oh, I forgot to mention one part. So there's one type of tobacco that's not talked about quite as much because it's not in your general cigarettes. It's called Oriental tobacco. And so this is the bougie tobacco that the pipe smokers use. It's the premium leaves. It's been dried and cured at a much more delicate rate, lower temperatures, higher humidity. And it's desired because of that complex aroma that it has. And so, I like to think that's maybe the one we should compare it to most because of the care and the aroma that they're expecting from that type of tobacco. All right, so newts. You might not at first think about how important nutrition is for the effects that's happening in post-harvest, but it's pretty important. If we think about potassium and chlorine, which you're like, why are you even talking about chlorine? They're quite important in tobacco, and their effects are real to the point where the people who are bringing in tobacco and buying the tobacco, it has to meet certain checkpoints in order for them to put it into their cigarettes. And these are some of those checkpoints. So potassium, high potassium, and I don't mean high as far as toxicity high as in adequate white ash. And cigarette producers want the customer to have white ash. And that's what our industry, loves and beckons and, brags about having the white versus black or gray. Potassium helps with scent, and it regulates a lot of the osmotic and aroma leaf conversions, specifically in the leaf. Chlorine, this can actually hinder the smoke. So if there's too much chlorine, there's excessive starches in the leaf, it becomes very kind of thick, really high waxy level, and it's terrible. So when tobacco leaves are brought in from the farm, they're checked for these elements. And if they're not right, it's denied because they have their standards. And so, are these pieces that we need to consider that we're not actually considering? And what's interesting is that, all of these effects are what we're seeing in curing, but it's based off of what we're applying when it's in the field. So nitrogen is the most interesting to me, right? No doubt we all know that we have to feed our plants nitrogen, but we all know that, especially if you've been growing probably 10 years, you've probably been applying way too much nitrogen and probably every other type of fertilizer. I mean, that's the way the nutrient companies supply it, most, and that's what's recommended online. I mean, when there's not extension or universities to talk to about what you should be applying, you're going to follow your farmer friend who's doing it. And so this is how it's always been. So excess nitrogen, it causes weird flavors in tobacco, spicy, and they actually associate it with having lower nicotine content. And so this seems like, okay, fine, but this next piece is what's really interesting. So what about the metabolites of nitrogen? So this word's gonna get me too. Nitrosamines, they're organic compounds that we find in all sorts of fruits, everything in our daily life, meats that are salt cured, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't avoid them as a public completely, we can't. But absolutely keeping them in lower levels is something that the EPA and the FDA keep an eye on. And so this is something not important for quality, but important for safety. And it's because it's a carcinogen. So the fresh tobacco leaf, these are not there. It's only when it's burned does it combine with alkaloids where it turns into this product that is really toxic. Studies in tobacco have shown that really high application rates in fields can lead to really high rates, within the leaves, meaning higher danger. So there are many, many studies out there that show, here's under applying, here's optimal, and here is over applying, and here's you risking the public's health. Not that cigarettes are great for you, but you know what I'm saying. And so, is this a reason to add to the why we should flush question? Bugby was talking about this morning how in his studies when they flushed in the leaves, it would significantly decrease all elements. But in the flower, it actually minimally decreased it. So, it might not actually be a 1 or 2 week kind of deal where we're not having this effect and losing the risk by flushing, but with people in general not using a 3, 4, 5 EC, this could actually produce a better product, safer product, just by giving the plant what it's using, not what will bank nitrogen in the plant. So this is put out by California EPA, and it's based off of marijuana and tobacco, showing that in their tests that the levels of these toxic elements from combustion were pretty much the same in tobacco versus marijuana. And so I would totally recommend reading this. It's pretty interesting, but you can see down at the bottom are those nitrogen metabolites. And when compared to the tobacco smoke versus marijuana smoke, they're pretty close to each other, which was surprising and disappointing for me, but that's the way it is, something to think about when you're applying nitrogen. All right, phosphorus helps with sugar creation. It's if not keeping it under, if kept at the proper levels, it can help with your sugar content. Magnesium was another interesting one. If kept at about 2%, it enhances the combustibility. And so I had to dig in, what does combustibility mean exactly? And so it's just the ease of lighting. The ease of lighting and staying lit. It's not too hot where it would burn fast, and then the faster and the harder it burns, the harsher it is on your throat, and it's not too slow where it keeps going out. So they really wrap around magnesium around that quality checkpoint. Okay, so we know what we need to check for by recommendation of the tobacco industry to realize how we can judge a good cure. I mean, obviously there's always, bringing people in to test it, but we have to know where to start. So this is where we're gonna start. This is my favorite 2 slides of the talk. And I feel like I'm gonna get a lot of hate for this, but I don't care. So rehydration is bad. And obviously there's limits of that. This is work Noel from UGA did. On the top right is barn dried. So this is Georgia in the summer. It's hot as can be. Humidity is all over the place. The trichomes look terrible. And almost every one of them are busted open. You look at the one on the bottom, this is a controlled 60-60, traditional setup, DHU, AC, and they're not perfect by any means, but they're a lot better than the situation where the environment had crazy fluctuations. Again, known in tobacco, when you're taking these cells that have encapsulated and trapped in these volatiles and you're rehydrating it, you're getting cells that are rupturing again and releasing those volatiles. Then those cells die and brown, and from there it's just downhill. So throughout drying, keeping a steady decrease, and then in curing, making sure you're not putting your curing buckets in a room that's 70 degrees or 70% humidity and rehydrating it. I've seen growers with millions and millions of dollars put into just the drying area, and it's dried perfectly, and then they put it in these buckets and they're curing, and then they open those buckets for 4 hours, and in that room it's 70% humidity, and so it's all rehydrating, and they wonder why it smells so terrible. Well, you're putting all that energy and resources into one thing, but you're not watching these little metrics that you need to. So swings are important to control. The other thing I want to kind of put out there is just because you smell the terpenes, is that actually a good thing? So let me rephrase that. If you're in your drying room, if you're in your curing room, and you're getting knocked out by the smell of terpenes, is that necessarily something to brag about? Because it's in the air, it's not in the flower. So keeping these cells unfractured, unruptured by not rehydrating, I think is really going to be key. But all of that's about engineering and helping us keep the set points we want. Okay, so this is actually my favorite one. So this is the barn cured. And so I hope I can ingrain this in your mind when you're thinking of, it's okay, they'll buy it, we don't care. So this is what you don't want to give your customers. So it's the lost soul of the Little Mermaid. I don't know, when I was looking through these pictures she sent me, I was like, that looks terrible. And all I can see is those little creatures from the Little Mermaid. So. But in my thought process, everything we've talked about so far can be enhanced or not by the gases, right? It all plays together. Ethylene. I think ethylene is very important. A lot of the studies we did You know, we were looking at the effect of ethylene in curing. Well, I think that was the wrong time to look at ethylene. I think looking at it in drying, in that short, you know, 2-day window, right when it has the highest water content, it's got the highest, you know, metabolic activity going on, you know, this is when ethylene is the most important. And going back to legacy moves, you know, burping, is this releasing that? AB. So this, again, this is in cure. So this is after the flower's already at 0.6. You know, the purge buckets showed no ethylene. The not purged buckets had accumulation. And so, you know, the rates that this would be, again, when the plant has more moisture, are absolutely much higher. So, more to come. So basically, I just gave you my outline for what I'll be working on for the next year. It took a minute, but finally got the tools and resources to be able to really test for these sugars, tests for how this is changing, you know, looking at brown bud and understanding why, and taking some of these theories that have been borrowed from other industries and applying them and getting hard data paired with data from the smoke and what the people think of how it feels. So I'm excited for the next year, and this is definitely what I get my kicks out of these days. All right. Any questions? You know, I think it's fair to say, if I had to give you one answer this second, 60-60. But I think it's important to have really tight controls for that, because just because you put that as a set point doesn't mean it's actually what's happening in your room. So having a way to graph that out and potentially manipulate your set points to give you that, because, you know, you're working with equipment. Just because you put that number in doesn't mean that's what you're getting. So I would definitely play with your HVAC and DHU until your peaks and lows are tighter. I didn't hear you all the way. I was trying to. I think there's a mic behind you.
So when trying to consider, would say most grows are limited by their facility design, or maybe their labor, the size of their dry cure room. So there's multiple ways you can approach it. A full plant dry, a de-limbing, or even a bucked flower that they're drying out on next. And I know the ideal range was about 7 to 10 days based on that particular graph. So I was curious, what was the approach on that dry that you used for the study? And then if there's any recommendations entirely personally or by the data that you would recommend if you had the ability to design around an optimal.
So, you know, if you're struggling with humidity, the easiest thing you can do is defoliate prior to putting your plants in there. Because, you know, all of that mass, which has water in it, you're not having to then use your equipment to remove. And so that's always a good tip if you're battling humidity, is just do any sort of removal you can. I mean, and that includes stems too. But then also a lot of times hanging full stems is easier because it's one cut and one hang versus individual. But you're having to dry that stem too. So if you want it to be faster, or if you're struggling with moisture, that would definitely be a trick to get it down. Mike, in that study were these just individual buds?
Do you think there could be a benefit to having a prolonged drying by having a full plant hang, in the sense of like you're allowing the enzymatic reactions to persist longer, but you're still keeping that steady flow of outward water?
I do. So in tobacco, it's a 2-day for that fermentation enzymatic happening to happen. That's what they feel is adequate. But they're also at 150 degrees. And so, with us having maybe the first 3 or 4 days, lower temperatures, but still maybe not quite as high as 70%, because then you're risking microbes. But having a little bit of delay, I think could be good. Again, I might get up here next year and say that was a terrible idea, but that's my guess off of what I've read from other industries and motives.
I appreciate talking theory. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Have a great evening.